Defence spending has to rise, but how can it be paid for? I don't want to be one of those people who calls for more money for defence, but won't say how to fund it, because that's basically a dishonesty on the British public. So Donald Trump has made it clear that the era of blank cheques from the United States is over, but the threat from Russia remains. This means we must find the cash from an economy that is overtaxed and low growth. There's no room for tax increases, so spending priorities must be changed. Hard choices must be made. Defence needs more, and it must come from other budgets. So, first for the chop, in the firing line is overseas aid at nearly £14 billion a year. At least half of it should be redirected to defence. It's time to stop the absurd overseas aid spending, which includes £5 million on, wait for it, transforming feminist funding in Iraq, £25 million for green urban growth in Somalia, and £38 million for green growth in Nepal. If you've got some green scheme in a poorer part of the world, the British government will pay for it. In addition, if we left the ECHR and closed our borders effectively, we could go further rather than wasting cash out of the overseas aid budget on bogus asylum seekers. Next, in the firing line is the bogus civil service. Boris Johnson had a plan to cut it by 20%. Which would have saved about £5 billion annually. That, too, must go to defence. And at a time when taxpayers have been mercilessly squeezed, with thresholds being frozen now for several years, the welfare recipients they pay for have not been affected. This year's 1.7% increase in benefits, other than pensions, should be frozen, adding another £2.5 billion for defence. Then the crazy schemes should go. Green subsidies and follies must be abandoned. Carbon capture and storage would save £20 billion a year in total if it were given up. We'd also save billions if the Chancellor had any gumption and ordered the Governor of the Bank of England to stop selling bonds for quantitative tightening purposes and just let them mature. This has been a tragic waste of money. If all this were done, there would be at least £20 billion extra for the Ministry of Defence, and perhaps we would begin to be taken seriously again. Donald Trump is right. For too long, the UK and Europe has been too comfortable relying on the US as a security blanket, taking money away from defence and using it to lie back and live the easy life of welfare, dependency and flabbiness. It is in our own interests to hear what he has to say, and remember that the first duty of government is defence of the realm. As ever, let me know your views via mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm very pleased now to be joined by the defence specialist Andrew Fox, as well as my most intellectual panel, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Sir John Redwood, and the former Labour MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle. Andrew, let me come to you first, because we need more money for defence, but actually shouldn't a first starting point be the Ministry of Defence spending its money well?
Yes, I fully agree. And I think we've got a track record of procurement failure. And also of the Army, and other members of Defence organising themselves in ways that just don't make sense. So we saw the last Defence review where we put effectively a decision to be the world's counterinsurgency gendarmerie rather than a coherent fighting division. And our one division now is 2 brigades and a half brigade.
Just explain, what is 2 brigades and a half brigade? What does this mean in numbers and capacity?
So the Army works in threes. So it's 3 battle groups to a brigade.
And how many people in a battle group?
450.
Okay.
And a number of tanks, of course. 3 battle groups to a brigade, 3 brigades to a division, 3 divisions to a corps. We always worked on the 2-division setup. So when I joined the Army, we had 1 division and 3 division. And now we're simply down to 2.5 brigades comprising our 1 deployable division. So we've been absolutely cut to the bone. And the Army has, in many ways, been the architect of its own errors.
And isn't this a reminder that ultimately you need boots on the ground? If you're going to do things, you need numbers. It's all very well having tech and having guided missiles and so on, but if you're to secure territory, you need a physical presence.
Yes, absolutely. You cannot take and hold ground with a drone. You cannot take and hold ground with artillery. What we need is what Field Marshal Slim called the full orchestra of war. So not only do we have to have the tanks and the soldiers to crew them, but we need the logistics chain to make sure fuel and ammunition gets to the front lines. We need to make sure there are medical forces to get wounded soldiers backwards. Air support is absolutely vital, and we're seeing that in Ukraine all day long, that would make the key difference for the Ukrainians in this conflict, as if they had air power, and they don't. So we need everything singing together, and the MOD needs to be a far better conductor for that orchestra.
And so are we once again seeing British politicians committing troops without actually having the capacity to do it, as we did in Iraq with Tony Blair, that we make these promises, but we don't have the substance behind it?
Well, I think what we're seeing with Mr. Starmer today is political manoeuvring rather than a credible promise to put troops on the ground, because we never do anything without an alliance. Even if we go back to Waterloo, we had the Prussians.
Had Blucher.
Yeah, exactly so. We simply don't do stuff independently yet, and we certainly don't now when we're as small as we are. And without the buy-in from other countries to go alongside us and deploy at the same time and provide the gaps in capability that we can't fill, all Mr. Starmer's really doing is making a political manoeuvre rather than a serious promise.
So, Lloyd, let me bring you in. Is that your view of it, that this is a political manoeuvre and that Starmer is trying to be a bridge between the US and Europe? But there's no desire for a bridge. America isn't interested in that. They want to see our money rather than a bridge.
Well, I think that there is a need to politically manoeuvre at the moment because the desire from the West is to ensure that Ukraine has the strongest possible hand going into these negotiations. And we were always going to get to negotiations. We were always going to get, I'm afraid, to territory being given up to the Russians. That was always, there's no other solution here. The solution is, how do we get to a situation that both Ukraine and Russia can live with? And if they want to both live with it, we need to make sure Ukraine has the best possible hand to be able to push back. So it's only, say, Crimea that was never really properly Ukrainian in the first place. So those things need to happen, and that's what this is. That's what Sir Keir is doing. I don't think realistically he is saying that we would put troops on the ground in any form of hot war. And bearing in mind, if we put them in as peacekeeping troops, they also are counted for overseas development aid.
But in terms of a hot war, we don't want to get in the situation that the Dutch were in the former Yugoslavia, when they couldn't stop a massacre because they didn't have the right engagement rules. Yes. But this needs money. Now, where would you get the money from? You probably wouldn't take all of my choices, but where would you get the money from?
Well, I think already we are one of the largest contributors in terms of percentage of GDP in Europe to our armed forces. So we are not We're
way behind America. We're way behind Poland.
We are not the slack here in Europe. But where we will need to make some changes is we will need, I think you're quite right, on the Bank of England bonds. The way that we treat this Bank of England debt is complete madness because it means that we are paying huge amounts and that is totally unnecessary. There are, of course, things to look at in our overseas development aid. Now, you can, without decreasing the overseas development aid, you can divert some of that money to peacekeeping operations. I mean, I think it's a disgrace that the largest peacekeeping contribution troop force in the world is Nigeria, then Bangladesh. These are poor countries. If they can contribute troops, why on earth aren't we contributing more troops to peacekeeping? And if that means peacekeeping, if that means peacekeeping in Ukraine, then what happens is money is diverted from the Foreign Office budget. It goes to the defence budget, but it doesn't mean a reduction in foreign aid. It just means a targeting of foreign aid to really the matters that matter in the world, which is peace of our time.
John, everyone is coming round to your view that the Bank of England must stop selling bonds badly, and I think it's only fair to say that you were the first person to raise this issue and point out that there are billions of pounds in current budgets that are really being wasted by the Bank of England's incompetence. Do you agree that defence spending needs to go up and that we need to take up our moral obligation to global security?
Well, I think we need a lot more defence. And yes, I suspect we will have to pay a bit more, but I think we also need to do a really big job on the MOD. I think we've got far too many people working as civilians or as officers in desk jobs in the MOD and not providing fighting capability. And as we've already heard from our expert, the procurement has tipped billions down the drain in no good purpose, producing quite unique British kit at great cost and with great complication. I mean, take the Ajax vehicle. Not the most sophisticated thing in the world to produce an armoured vehicle, you would have thought. And you don't have to have complete state-of-the-art one. You just want a rugged, functioning, relatively safe one. And we 3 billions later, there have been about 20 of them delivered, and they weren't usable. I mean, it was just appalling.
Well,
we can't afford that.
But we've also got mad schemes to have electric vehicles to put into the front line when there are no charging points. I mean,
yes, the idea of putting a charging point on a battlefield does...
the green ideology seeps into everything and is doing so much damage to the economy.
Yes, indeed. But I think there's a lot of money there to squeeze out or to better deploy, and either the same people deployed in different roles, closer to being deliverable force, or different types of people recruited, which you can do over a time period. But I think above all, this government, who is conducting a strategic review quite rightly, needs to ask, what are our realistic aims for our armed forces, and then what do they need in terms of people and equipment? Because we clearly haven't got enough at the moment. I mean, I don't think we can defend the islands effectively enough, so we need perhaps an Iron Dome so that we're protected against missiles.
Andrew, what are you hoping from the strategic review? Do you think it's going to be something we're going to afford, and that our new Churchill in the form of the Reverend Starmer will be able to deliver this?
Well, if we can make it to 2.5%, that's a start. I think the bigger issue is no matter how much money we're given for defence, we still have to find the people to wear uniform, the vehicles to put them in, the training estates to train them on, somewhere for them to live, somewhere for there to be barracked. And obviously over the past 30 years, we've cut all of those things so drastically that to replace them in any quick order is just simply not going to happen. And so, as well as a decent amount of funding from the Defence Review, what I'm looking for is proper strategic thinking with an actual plan and an end state to get us to where we need to be, because it's not going to be an easy fix.
And this
but
is
if
the
we were actually fighting a war, let's hope we're not going to be, we'd fix those things overnight. The necessity would be the mother of invention. We need some of that spirit without the war.
But I think we need to sell that to the British people. And even though Mr Starmer says it's existential, I don't think it is. It's an existential threat to perhaps the current Western order and the current Western security scenario, but it's not an existential threat to the United Kingdom. When we go back to 1939, we can clearly see that's an existential threat. So persuading people they need to pay more tax or endure civil service cuts is going to be the challenge, I think.
Thank you very much. Existential has become a very fashionable word. Thank you to Andrew and to my panel.